When I open the door to the transmitter shack, the world greets me the same way it has for years, with a heat that presses and a silence that answers. The sky hasn't been honest in a long time. It's a low, bruised ceiling streaked with ash and dust, like someone tried to paint over a wound and only made it worse. The sun sits behind that bruised glass and throws a pale, tired light that warms nothing and burns everything it touches. Rivers I used to know are memories written in cracked earth. Where water once ran, gullies yawn and glitter with salt. The riverbanks are libraries of lost things. A child's sneaker bleached white, a rusted shopping cart half buried, bones picked clean by wind. In places the sea took what it wanted. In others, the land simply gave up. Coastal towns are chessboards of drowned buildings, their lower floors full of silt and drowned furniture. Inland, cities have been sun-bleached into skeletons, glass facades melted into molten mirrors, office towers half-toppled, their steel ribs exposed like the bars of a cage. Highways curl and fracture like dried skin. Bridges sag where weight once mattered. Landmarks we used to take postcards of are unrecognizable. A clock tower that no longer tells time. A stadium roof collapsed into a field of ragged metal. A cathedral whose stained glass is now just colored shards under the dust. The weather stopped being weather and started being an enemy. Summers stretched for years until the idea of a season seemed quaint. We learned to count heat waves the way old men count scars, by number and severity. Wildfires became a continent-sized breath, ripping across what remained of forests and towns, leaving blackened trunks like the bones of whales on shore. Then came the storms, not the cleansing ones we used to talk about, but chemical storms, heavy with ash from distant fires and with rain that tasted of metal. The sky would open and pour acid into puddles, forcing us to flee or watch our last reserves corrode in the rain. Air tastes tired. It carries the small things, the tang of salt, the metallic sweet of battery acid, the persistent, dull rot that comes out of abandoned food stores. When the wind is right, you can smell the ocean. On other days, you only smell dust and the ghost of diesel. Sound is strange here. Cities that used to hum with traffic have become hollow. The wind is the new orchestra, playing wind through broken glass, a mournful piano with missing keys. Sometimes you hear engines in the distance and your chest tightens. Other times you hear nothing and quiet is worse than a scream. Civilization didn't collapse all at once. It eroded, a little at a time, like concrete washing into the sea. Governments stopped pretending they could fix it. Offices emptied, then closed. The phones rang into oblivion. Borders mean less when there's no food on the other side. Some institutions tried to hold. Clinics became triage tents under tarps. Universities turned into fortresses of papers and futile experiments. Churches took to packing people in for water allocations. But most of that structure was paper and ritual. Paper was no defense when the soil stopped holding. Money lost its magic. What mattered was who had water, who had seeds, who had a working engine and the skill to fix it. Survivors split into kinds like a broken mirror. There are the small bands, foragers who move like careful animals, learning the old patterns of the land, skimming pools where rain has pooled and trading scavenged batteries for canned food. There are the caravans, slow armored convoys that move between ruined towns, bartering, trading, sometimes stealing. Then there are the raiders, the ones who traded their maps for machetes and learned the language of force. They operate at night, taking what they need and leaving messages carved in wood or spray-painted threats on concrete. Somewhere between those is the new economy. Water brokers with code names who sell access to wells. Old engineers turned into fixers who can coax a generator to life for a favor or a ration. And the quiet, dangerous diplomacy of shared radio frequencies. Institutions that once meant order now mean memory. The hospital downriver is a shell whose windows frame the sky. Inside, record books curl like fossilized leaves. The post office is where the lost mail piles up, and the stamps have become decorations on blankets. Police precincts are forts for those who could hold them. Most civic services ended up either privatized by force or transformed into small community councils clinging to the illusion of law. Trust is currency now. You trade it seldom and you value it like a keepsake. The rule of law has devolved into rules people make to survive. Don't walk alone through the valley at dusk. If you take from a camp, leave something in return. Don't fire at a radio tower unless you're ready to defend what you get. And yet some things endure. Radio towers scratch the sky, battered but alive, because radios are cheap and the air is still a place for hope to travel. I can sit in this shack with a pedal generator and reach someone 20 miles away who is listening because they, too, are starved for a voice. That voice is dangerous and sacred. It can move people, warn them, make arrangements, summon hope or panic. We live by rules nobody wrote down but everyone learned. Filter your water twice, burn moldy wheat, never let a child touch a lead battery. We learn to read the land the way previous generations read books. We listen for the weather like it is news, study the patterns in ash, and whisper about rain like a prayer. Every small discovery, a spring found under rubble, a greenhouse once tended and left to bloom wild, becomes legend. This place is a map of losses and little survivals stitched together. The world has been altered beyond the fix of polite government decrees. Trees regrow where the flames missed. Moss finds a niche in the cracked concrete. Life is not gone. It's just quieter and more careful. I stand at the window of the shack, feeling the heat on my face, and I wait for a change, for a signal, for the sound of wheels. The anticipation sits in my bones like a warning drum. Something will come. It always does. What we do when it does is the only story left worth telling. They gave me a name once, Miles Harrington, and for years it fit like a suit. Now the name is a radio handle and a memory stitched to a photograph that lives under a jar of screws. I still answer to it when I tune the transmitter, because names are small anchors in a sea that wants to swallow everything. When I speak into the microphone, I am both Miles and not Miles. A voice that carries warnings, a storyteller, a neighbor with a map of where the last pump works. I am, for lack of a better word, a keeper of a small flame. Before the world turned, I fixed other people's radios for a living. I knew impedance, vacuum tubes, and how to make a tired solder joint behave like new. I can coax warmth out of cold metal and life out of a generator that coughs and refuses to die. Those skills are currency now. They keep the transmitter humming, keep a dim light on in the shack, and bring a few people within earshot who'd otherwise have nothing but their own breath and the wind. I learned to trade wire for canned peaches, and to trade a working capacitor for a handful of seeds. There's a dignity to it, the dignity of being useful. Usefulness means someone will tell you where the next convoy is headed, or who to avoid in the valley at dusk. My days begin before heat becomes a weapon. I pedal the generator, slow, steady circles, until the tubes warm and the dial flickers alive. The hum becomes a weather for me. I listen to it the way I used to listen to a heartbeat. Then I take inventory. Fuel, water, bandages, the little things that mean the difference between a bad night and a bad morning. I check the antenna lines, climb the ladder with my harness and a careful breath, and tune the rig. The voice in the headset becomes a bridge. I talk to people I have never seen, and sometimes to people I used. To know the sound of human conversations again is to be reminded that we're still here. Survival is mechanics and memory. I know how to filter water too, passes through a ceramic filter, then charcoal, then the slow boil under a patched pot. I know which weeds are edible and which will make you forget where you live. I know to patch a tire with a piece of inner tube and to hide the repair kit where raiders never look, in a cracked Bible wedged under the floorboards. I keep seeds in a metal biscuit tin wrapped in waxed cloth, beans, peas, a stubborn strain of tomato that refuses to die. We rotate them like treasures. When fuel is scarce, I walk, and when I walk, I trade favors for favors. A lesson in how to splice a broken solar lead for a night's shelter. But survival is not only about the practical. It's about the small human economies that keep us sane. I keep a list of voices, a ledger of names and traits scribbled in a notepad with a pencil stub. There's Joan, who runs a scavenger band and hums hymns to keep her people steady. Omar, who tends a greenhouse behind a collapsed school and who taught me how to coax lettuce out of dust. And young Leela, who once crawled into the shack carrying a battered radio and a jar of pickled apricots and asked me if radio people are angels. Each voice is a line on a map, and the map helps me sleep. Loss is the marrow of my bones. I remember a kitchen that was warm and loud, a woman with a laugh that could make the radio static soften, 2 kids who colored outside the lines, a cat that slept on the stack of technical manuals. The house is gone now, a rubble heap where a fig tree pushes through an overturned stove. I found the photograph after the first winter without snow, half burnt and curled, and I press it to my palm when the nights bleed into each other. People ask why I keep broadcasting when it brings trouble with it. The truth is simple and ugly, because if I stop, the world will feel smaller. If I stop, the voices I call out to will stop being found, and then there will be only the wind. There are nights when the shack feels too small for the things I hold. There are nights when the static eats my words, and I think of what I left behind: a degree, a small mortgage, an entire language of furniture. There are lines you cross in this life. Sometimes I trade kindness for food. Sometimes kindness becomes a liability. Once, I opened the gate to a family that had been tracked by a raider band. I let them in, fed them, and the next week they were gone, leaving behind the echo of a laugh and a missing can of beans. I still can't tell whether I was naive or brave. The truth sits between those two and tastes the same. Guilt follows like a shadow. I watch the faces of neighbors and remember decisions that could have been better. There were people I couldn't save because I didn't have the fuel to go farther, because the generator coughed and died, and I had to ration my life to the few who always made it to the shack. I wake with the guilt fresh as a cut. It is an unhelpful teacher, relentless and precise, but it is also a compass in a world with few maps. If anything, loss taught me the rules we now live by. Say what you mean, ration the truth as carefully as water, and always leave space on the shelf for someone who might walk in on a bad day. My hands tell the story better than my mouth. They are dark with grease and calloused in a way that makes me think of old maps, creased, valued, useful. A scar runs down my left wrist from glass the day the truck stopped coming. It still stings in the rain. My voice carries a gravely note now, a product of long nights speaking into a microphone, of smoke inhalations, of yelling over engines. People tell me my voice is the reason they keep their own, that it anchors them in a time when everything else floats loose. That weighs on me and drives me to be careful with what I say. Voices can start fires. They can also teach someone how to fix a filter, how to treat a burn, how to signal with a mirror to a convoy 10 miles away. The broadcasts are small acts of practical mercy, wrapped in stories. There is a rhythm to hope in this life. It's not a big thing, it is a set of small rituals. Every morning I wire a note to the post outside. Weather hot, water rationed, seed swap Wednesday. People read it and add their own scratches. Sometimes a stranger pins a scrap with coordinates to an old well, and we all squint at the handwriting as if it were scripture. I plant seeds in the community garden patch Omar tends, a stubborn, absurd garden in the hollow of a collapsed parking garage. When a sprout unfurls its first leaf in a world that prefers to explode, it feels like a trumpet. Trust, more than water, is the currency that keeps settlements breathing. It is fragile. I have learned to keep both a list of those I've trusted and a list of those I've forgiven myself for losing faith in. Forgiveness, in a day-to-day sense, becomes practical. You forgive yourself so you can keep moving. I carry the faces of the people I love in a way that has taught me how to speak to strangers. The voice I use on the radio is not the voice that narrates my private grief. On air I am steady, in the shack I am honest. And then there is duty. I tell people where the storms are rolling, where the raiders have been sighted, and where the last convoy left a cache of medicine. Sometimes the information keeps a child alive. Sometimes it brings trouble. But I keep the line open because survival without story feels like aimless endurance. Story organizes grief into a direction, makes it something that can be passed forward. I tell small truths, how to filter, how to boil, how to mend. I tell larger ones sometimes. About the greenhouse up north that might have space, about a community that once told me I'd be welcome in winter. Whether those things are true or hopeful lies shifts with the wind, but telling them moves people, and movement is a kind of life. When the world is at its worst, and the heat seems to press the radio shack into the ground, I remember a child's question. Are radio people angels? I do not think we are angels. We are not saviors. We are people with tools and patience and a stubborn refusal to let silence win. I am at best a conduit, a person who carries messages between pockets of humanity like a mail carrier in a city that no longer exists. I am tired. I am sometimes afraid. I am heavier with loss than I ever thought I could be. But I am also stubborn in a way that is almost childish. I hold the line because someone once told me that if you keep calling, someone will answer. So I call into the dark and wait for voices to answer, because as long as someone answers, the world is not entirely lost. They call it a drought, but that word feels polite, like a word you use when you don't want to admit the house is on fire. We have been living inside and unraveling for years. Heat that sits like a heavy stone on the chest of the world, fires that run like liquid across hills, and storms that come with poison in their mouths. The crisis I'm fighting from this transmitter shack is not a single thing I can point at and fix. It's a sequence of betrayals by the weather and by the systems we once trusted. Rivers that stopped remembering how to be rivers, aquifers that emptied like wallets picked clean, and seasons that forgot how to follow each other. At the start it was the slow stuff, snowpack that never showed up in spring, reservoirs drawn down to puddles, wells delivering a trickle where we expected a promise. Then the heat, not summer in its normal arrogance, but a permanent high-pressure blanket that held the sky in place and roasted everything underneath. The air itself changed. It held more moisture in some places and none in others. The winds that used to move storms moved less, and when they stalled, weather systems baked or drowned a region for months. The scientists on frequencies we used to trust called it a stationary heat dome, and muttered about altered jet streams, warm oceans, and feedback loops that used to be academic. To us, all of that translated into a map of shortages. Rivers keep that picture. Rivers used to be a thing you could navigate by memory. Now they are a ledger of loss. The Missouri, the Mississippi, the rivers that were arteries in the old maps, cracked skin and salt. The old channels pocked with algae blooms the size of towns where what little water remained sits, boiled green. Snowpacks that fed summer flow had been the planet's slow-release water bank. Without it, the whole economics of water collapsed. It doesn't rain the way it once did, and when it does, sometimes it comes with ash and chemicals, and the ground refuses to drink. Young wells go dry because the water table falls faster than roots can follow. Old wells fail because pumps seized from disuse, or because the old municipal systems no longer get maintenance. The result? Competition. Bad blood over pumps. Convoys moving with jerry cans like treasure caravans. People who once would have called themselves neighbors learning the vocabulary of distrust. Fire moved like a predator. When lightning struck in a dry place, the fire would run on the fuels our ancestors left behind. Forests overgrown in places where management had stopped being a hobby and became an argument. Suburbs built from highly flammable materials. Grasslands turned brittle by drought. Wildfires now chained together in megafires that cross fire breaks and turn towns into black silhouettes. Smoke covers regions for months. We learn to read the sky for the ash. Smoke is not only suffocating. It corrodes engines. It kills solar panels by laying a film across them. It fouls filters. It ruins air you might have hoped to breathe and wires you might have hoped to rely on. And then, Once in a while, the weather flips the script. The same systems that won't give us rain will, suddenly and without mercy, dump stores of rain in hours. Sudden flash floods that sweep through dry riverbeds and collapse makeshift bridges and bury whole camps under slurry. Saltwater storms come up the coasts, carrying sea into places that used to belong to people who never thought about tides. It's a chaos of too much and too little, often in the same season. Why is survival getting harder every day? Because the small buffers that used to make human settlements resilient are gone. No snowpack, no mountain springs, infrastructure decayed and left to rust. Supply chains that once refilled food and medicine and parts are fractured into whispers and sometimes violent silence. The cumulative effects of decades of extraction and mismanagement mean we are beginning at the bottom of the well, and the bucket has a hole in it. What that looks like for me in the shack: water reserves are down to 2 50-gallon drums and 3 milk jugs of filtered supply that I ration like a miser counts coins. Fuel is less than 2 weeks' worth at the current broadcast schedule if I run the generator to keep the transmitter alive. I conserve by broadcasting in shorter bursts, using the pedal generator when I can. Medical supplies are sparse. A box of antibiotics opened last winter, gauze, a syringe with no matching vial, and a half-used roll of antiseptic. Seeds are cherished. They are the future and also dangerous knowledge. Someone might come looking for them. Encounters with other survivors have grown sharper. There are people who come to trade and leave with a part of your life because they feel no other way to survive. There are caravans with flags and makeshift armor who operate somewhere between trade guild and warband. Some of them call themselves communities, others raiders. I've had friendly caravans. A woman named Joan who runs a small ring of foragers and who always brings extra water when she can. A thing I'm convinced is habit or ritual rather than reason. I've had traders who left me with a cache of antibiotics for teaching a mechanic how to rebuild a pump from parts found in an abandoned factory. And yes, there have been men with rifles who came under the cover of dusk and left with more than they came with. You learn fast to make trade-offs. You trade information sometimes to barter for fuel. You withhold other information because telling it could sign a target on your back. There are alliances, thin as thread but real. A small network of radio operators, us, trades information the old maps do not carry. Well at coordinates X is dry, but the cistern under the church still has 3 small barrels if you disguise it as salvage. We run checks. Who answers after midnight? Who has a working pump motor? Who is willing to trade seeds for medical supplies? The problem is that every piece of information is both a lifeline and a risk. Tell someone about a functioning well and you might save a life. Tell the wrong someone and a convoy of raiders will follow the scent. Resources don't just run out, they become dangerous. Water can be poisoned by agricultural runoff and by contaminated stormwater. Food rots quickly in heat and must be properly preserved. Fuel goes off, old gasoline gums up carburetors. Diesel emulsifies with water if not stored right. Batteries lose charge and replacement cells are rarer than a good night's sleep. Technology fails when parts fail, and parts are no longer produced. You cannibalize one rig to keep another alive. Everything becomes a salvage operation. Learning to repurpose, to turn a motor into a pump, a satellite dish into a rain catcher, an old refrigerator into a seed storage unit becomes the day-to-day life. If you're going to understand how to fight this practically, here are the things we taught ourselves the hard way. These are small, actionable steps born of necessity, not optimism. Water, capture everything. Roof runoff funnel should be the first thing any camp erects. A simple gutter into barrels, then into a ceramic or sand charcoal filter, will change thirst into possibility. Boil water for at least 1 full minute after a rolling boil to kill most pathogens. If you are above 2,000 meters, boil for 3 minutes. Make a solar still from a shallow pit, a collection bowl, and a sheet. It's slow but works when no fresh water exists. Learn to distill brackish water with basic condensers if you have metal, glass, and a heat source. Charcoal filters, charcoal from burned wood, sand layers, and gravel, will remove many particulates and improve taste. Combine filtration with boiling where possible. Rotate stored water in opaque containers to prevent algae and label dates. Food. Preserve when you can. Salt curing, pickling with vinegar, and smoking meat all work without refrigeration. Plant hardy, quick crops. Beans, legumes, some varieties of millet and sorghum that tolerate heat and poor soils. Save seeds from plants that performed. We learn to select for traits that survive heat and poor water. Learn edible local flora, weeds that nourish instead of poison. Trade for preserves and for knowledge. Power. Conserve. Run big loads in the early morning when temperatures are lower and batteries recover better. Maintain generators. Keep them clean of ash and debris. Change oil with scavenged alternatives when you must. Keep a spare spark plug and a strip of copper wire to jury-rig if needed. Solar panels must be cleaned of ash daily to maintain efficiency. Learn to hand crank or pedal charge for small batteries. Shelter and heat. Insulate rather than burn. Shade cloths and reflectors help. In wildfires, keep windows covered, vents filtered. For chemical storms, seal openings with damp cloth at first, then plastic sheeting if you can. Create low ventilation sleeping zones with a common compressor-like breathing break to reduce exposure. Security. Light discipline. Travel at dawn or dusk when heat and sight are less punishing. Use routes that avoid known ambush points. Keep paths to water quiet and discreet. Use radio contact protocols, short bursts, scheduled check-ins, and call signs. Broadcast only necessary information in the clear. We developed a cue system, an agreed 3-tone code that signals danger instead of a long gushing description that draws attention. Medicine. No basic triage, stop the bleeding. Clean wounds with boiled water and antiseptic. Elevate fractures, immobilize. Learn to read a wound for infection. A bad infection kills faster than a broken bone in the dust. Stockpile antibiotics as you find them and ration based on need, and barter for skills. We traded a working radio amplifier for someone's ability to stitch a wound. Those are the mechanics, the how-to. But the crisis is also a moral pressure. As supplies shrink, we are forced to choose who to help and who to leave. A band of foragers came to me months back begging for water, women, and children with eyes like broken glass. I had enough to help, but not without the risk that telling them where to refill would draw others. I gave them directions, and then we hid the spare fuel in a place only I knew. A week later, a raider group had found the route and took what they wanted. I still don't know if I did right. I only know the arithmetic of survival. The more you give, the more you risk losing what little keeps you alive. The less you give, the more you become a fortress and less a human. Scientific explanations sound clinical when my neighbor's child is thirsty, but they matter because they point to the map. Heat increases evaporation. Warm oceans destabilize storm tracks. Glacial and seasonal snow loss lowers summer stream flow. Groundwater extraction exceeded recharge for decades, and where aquifers were overdrawn, wells went dry. Plant cover diminished, and soils that used to hold water became dust that blew away or sealed with a film, refusing to drink. Once vegetation dies off at scale, the albedo changes and the land heats more, which makes drought worse, a feedback loop. Fires release carbon and particles that change the atmosphere, which change the climate, which changes the weather that devastates us. In plain words, our systems are connected, and once one breaks, the rest are likely to follow. So we prepare for cascades as much as for the singular events. A flood that destroys the means to get water, a fire that burns our food stores, a sudden storm that contaminates the last good well. We practice redundancy. That is the heart of the new survival ethic. Do not keep all your water in one barrel. Do not plant all your seeds in one patch. Do not let one person be the sole keeper of a critical skill. Build redundancy into everything. Share knowledge because knowledge is portable. An extra hand who knows how to mend a pump is worth 5 people who do not. There is urgency now. The ash in the sky is thicker than last season's. The reports I pass along on my frequency speak of a weather front building in the west that might save a few places with rain. Or it might stall and turn to acid. A caravan I trust reported seeing new flag markers from a warbend along the old railway. The bells in my chest are louder than they used to be. Every day the choices narrow. Every night the list of things I must check grows. Drums, filters, generator parts, antenna lines, the ledger of names who answered my last broadcast. Survival is no longer a fight against an abstract climate. It's now a fight against time, and the human choices time forces upon us. Still, amid the calculus of shortages and strategies, there is an urgency that is not only about scarcity. It is about preserving the social membrane. We can teach one another how to make a filter in the dark. We can swap seeds in songs. We can run check-ins and say the names of those we have lost so they are not taken by silence. That is another kind of preparation, ensuring that we do not become islands of loneliness in a world that has dissolved into archipelagos. Because the crisis is both external and internal. It is weather and storms and shortage, and it is also the erosion of the small rules that held us human. I keep the mic warm because the voice may be the thing that changes the day. A warning on the radio could move a child out of a path of flood. A note about a working pump could reroute a convoy to safety. A quiet line of code that tells people how to build a simple sand charcoal filter could save a dozen throats. So I map the crisis not only in the ledger of losses, but in actionable steps and in the slow, stubborn insistence that we share what we know. The storms will come whether we are ready or not. The question is what we will do when they hit. Who will stand, who will run, and who will be awake at the microphone calling names into the wind. They say drought eats patience first, until people who once waited in lines for coffee begin to measure their lives in ration sizes and check-in calls. Lately it feels like the drought turned predatory. Every quiet day shivers with the memory of a siren or the grind of tires against gravel. Sounds that used to mean errands and now mean choices. Leave the shack to get fuel and risk everything, or stay and hope the generator's choke holds out another night. The drums in the shack sit lower every week. 2 half-full barrels and the careful, dumb ritual of pouring a small cup into the filter and watching it catch the lull of particulates like slow applause. Food is lean. Canned goods that once judged my cupboard with abundance are now the high-scarcity items I bring out only to trade or to feed someone whose face is hollow with hunger. Fuel is the conversation that whispers behind every visit. When a vehicle rolls into view, even a broken one, every head turns like the planet's axis realigning. We had a scare 3 nights ago. The radio crackled in a voice I'd known for years, Jones' cadence soft, urgent. Miles they moved. 2 words like a dropped stone. In the shack, the hum of the generator felt suddenly too loud, as if it were announcing us. Jones' band had been a neighborly force for months. Foragers who respected boundaries and came with water when they could spare it. She is not the kind of person to trade in threats. When she says, they moved, she means someone dangerous has changed the map. Within hours there were reports on the frequency. A caravan with fresh paint on its flags, black with a white gear, spotted along the old rail line. They moved with purpose and with armor made from sheet metal and looted plates. They were efficient, meaning they were funded or well organized or both. Raiders, yes, but not the aimless kind. These were the kind who had a ledger and a leader and a plan beyond the next 5 miles. They took pump motors and left nothing of the clinic but a smashed door. They left messages painted on concrete, a gear, a line, a number. It's territorial language. The map grows teeth. I listened and logged and repeated. My role is to be the ledger of the living. I put Jones' alert on the air, careful and coded, check-in, Route 9, watch for stationary metal. The three-tone code we use for danger went out twice, soft and quick, because long announcements draw attention. People answered in trickles. Omar with a whisper about trees near the school greenhouse. Leela with a question that still sounds like a child. Are they the ones who took our well? She's 15 now. The voice that once asked if radios were angels carries grit. The caravan moved faster than anyone predicted. They took a small settlement 3 valleys over, one that had been generous, shared water, shared seed, and left in their wake not only theft but an unpinned vulnerability. That kind of raid rearranges trust. People who once walked 2 hours to barter now lock their doors and whisper plans. The small economies that kept communities alive trade of skills for food, protection for parts, fray overnight. Somebody somewhere is buying armor and bullets with something we cannot make ourselves. Running out of resources has a taste. It's metallic and small, and sits at the base of your tongue when you think of the next day's water. It changes how you answer radios. It changes the tone of your voice. There's an arithmetic. How many liters to get a generator to run an hour? How many hours of broadcasting might produce a barter in return? It feels like the math is stacked against us some days. And then there is the mystery that won't let the world settle. The rumor the caravans brought with them, stitched together from overheard comments and a map scrawled on the inside of a journal. Blue Well, they called it, a place up north past the line of the broken highway, where an old treatment plant supposedly still runs on a solar array no one believed would survive. The story shifts with each retelling. A desalination unit with a functioning membrane, a greenhouse with drip lines fed by pipes from an aquifer, a whole community living by clean, measured water. The name changes. Bluewell, Haven, the greenhouse. People talk about it like a religion or a scam, depending on their hunger. The first time I heard it on the air, a voice I didn't know simply said, "Try Sixtu. Ask for Leela." Sixtu was a code we used for barter routes years back. It was sloppy and reckless to put that out in the clear, but the voice vanished into static before anyone could pin it down. We ran checks. 15 people called to say they'd heard it. Joan came by with a scavenged map with a pencil circle and the word blue smeared at the margin. Omar shrugged and said he'd heard the name from someone who'd passed through with tomatoes, of all things. I wrote it down because that's what we do. We collect names and rumors like seeds. Some sprout. Most don't. But Bluewell introduced a new kind of hunger, not for food exclusively, but for the possibility of a community that had the means to survive without stealing. Imagine, a place that had managed to make a microeconomy not based on taking but on production. People began calling, offering pieces of information in exchange for coordinates. I'll tell you about a cache of solar panels if you tell me what Leela's doing. You could feel the teeth sharpening. Disclosure becomes a currency and a weapon. The moral calculus tightened. If Bluewell exists, telling too many people could mean its end. If it doesn't, believing in it might take energy away from building things here. I sat with the notepad in my lap and weighed both. I can invent hope. I can also be the person who crushes it. What I learned about myself in those hours was both simplifying and brutal. My voice can bless and betray. I cannot be both generous and naive. Meanwhile, the weather pressed like a hand against everything. The ash changed color to a darker gray, and the heat hinted at a coming shift. We had a small wind event that knocked a tree into Omar's greenhouse and sheared a length of Joan's storage tarp. Even those small things are a disaster in miniature. A knocked tarp can mean a ruined seed batch, a lost germination. The seasons are no longer seasons but events. You prepare for something that might or might not come, and when it does, it is rarely the thing you expected. Pressure surfaces in other choices. A trader with a cracked smile came through with a deal. A water filtration membrane, salvaged from a municipal plant. He said, in exchange for a day on the transmitter, a full day's broadcast that could run emergency comms and drum up trade. The membrane could change the arithmetic of life. It could buy an extra month of water for a pocket of people. But there's always a catch. The trader wanted the information I had held in my ledger, where the last convoy had been who had been on board with guns. I thought of Joan, of Omar, of Leela with her jar of pickled apricots. I thought of the covenant that makes us human. We keep each other's secrets, we give what we can. I declined the trader, not because I was noble, but because the ledger felt like a spinal cord. Expose it and we'd be paralyzed. That night the shack felt very small. I pedaled longer than usual, the straps biting my calves, because I was trying to make time pass and to keep the radio alive. The hum becomes a lullaby when worry would otherwise become a scream. Voices came in, as they always do. A man from the south with a voice like gravel saying his sister had a fever. A child from a farm who wanted to know if radio people could tell jokes. Joan asking about pump parts. It's a strange economy of need. Everyone asks for what matters most to them. Trust began to split into factions in my thinking. There is the trust that is earned by small, repeated kindnesses, water shared, seeds swapped, help with a generator belt. There is the trust that is merely a function of fear. You need someone to watch your back, so you give them a place at your table, and that is survival, not loyalty. And there is the kind of trust I fear most. The trust I put into myths because myths let you breathe. Blue well could be a myth that keeps people moving in a direction that saves them. It could be a mirage that sends them walking into a valley with no water and bad men with guns. Then came the night we had to run. Raiders hit a convoy less than 30 miles away during a dusk checkpoint, and the survivors of that convoy radioed for help. They were mostly civilians, the traders who had stayed behind to protect the cargo, not soldiers. The raiders used a tactic we had only heard of on the frequencies. A flash drive of loud noises, incendiary distractions, and a cutoff of the route back, so the convoy would split and become manageable. We heard static and then a child's voice asking for directions. I passed coordinates in a measured voice and added the code for caution. A patrol arrived and the convoy scattered into the night, but not before someone shot up the clinic's water store. Holes yawned in the plastic drums like mouths. I felt the guilt like a physical thing. Every time I sent coordinates, I asked myself, am I moving people toward safety or toward a map that another band will follow? Did the raiders have a list because someone gave it? Did my voice help or hurt? There is no clean answer in the math of survival. There are only consequences and a ledger that collects them. The internal struggle sharpened into a question. What am I protecting? The shack, the ledger, the people who come to it, or the idea that we still have human communities at all? I could sequester my knowledge and hoard it like a miser with the last good tool chest, and in doing so I would protect the physical things but perhaps doom the social membrane that makes cooperation possible. Or I could be loose with information and trust that people will behave in ways that preserve the community. History is not optimistic in these moments. I weigh the stories, the convoy that trusted and was broken, the trade that honored a promise, and I try to lose the cynicism enough to make decisions that are both humane and practical. At the same time, rumors began to take on initiative. A group calling itself the Engineers of the Old Line began leaving notes on derelict posts. Diagrams of a simple condenser, instructions to make a sand charcoal filter, coordinates to an old supply cache under the collapsed overpass. The notes were anonymous but meticulous. They smelled of an organized mind. Someone somewhere was trying to give away critical information freely. I broadcast their diagram in a short burst one night, careful to strip any identifying markers. The frequency lit up with gratitude and suspicion. A week later, someone reported finding the cache and leaving a spare pump in return. Small wins feel like manna, but wins are not enough. The heat climbed another degree, and the ash outside felt thicker. Joan's band moved their camp. Omar's sprouts shriveled under a late-season heat wave. The raiders changed tactics and began calling their ambushes collections, a euphemism that put teeth into language. Bluewell's rumor changed too. Someone now swore it had a desal plan, and others argued that desal would be useless without power. The arguments revealed more than facts. They revealed what people valued and what people feared. Water is both need and symbol. A community that provides it is a promise that survival can be organized around something other than taking. I kept calling. I kept cataloging. I kept my ledger open but my mouth careful. People answered because the shack is a place where rules still exist. We have strange rules here. Yes, no guns inside the radio radius. Trade openly and fairly. Do not call in coordinates for a prize unless you verify twice. Rules that are stitched from necessity. The rising action of our lives is not a single event but a braided set of pressures. The raiders, the rumor of a sanctuary, the heat, the dwindling drums, the moral arithmetic we all find ourselves doing. One night, after 3 sets of coordinates and an argument about whether to trust a man named Raffi who had an old military map, I fell asleep in the chair with the microphone light still blinking. I woke to Leela's voice in my ear. She had found something, a faded signpost with a blue arrow and the letters BW beneath, half buried in dust. She asked me if I thought it was Bluewell. The question was as simple as any children's question had been when she was small, and as heavy. I told her to hold the coordinates and to walk them into the ledger, not broadcast. She did. She is learning the ledger's weight. Tension is not only in the external. It is a pressure that sits between people now, a compressed spring that wants to uncoil into violence or into collective motion. We are all, in our way, deciding whether to be islands or bridges. The raiders have chosen to be predators. The engineers choose to be teachers. Joan and Omar pick a middle path of defense and generosity. Me, I stay behind the mic and try to steer the impulses towards something that doesn't end in more broken barrels. The rising action keeps building because the systems are all interlocked. The raiders want control. Control requires water. Water comes from places like Bluewell or from pumps and filtration and seeds, and the stubborn work of people who wake and tune, day after day. The moral choices hammer like a piston. Each choice is a push toward survival or toward collapse. I feel it in my hands when they ache from pedaling, in the ledger when a new name is added and another crossed out, in the small quiet moments when I open the jar of pickled apricots Leela left and taste a sweetness that feels like memory. So we move. Caravans reroute. People change their sleeping places. The engineers publish a diagram and someone builds a condenser. Joan trains her group in silent movement at dusk. Omar lines the greenhouse with shade cloth and learns new watering schedules. Leela writes in the ledger her small triumphs. One more sprout, one more tin of peaches traded. The raft of rumor, Bluewell, moves from myth to something people can organize toward. Whether it is a real place or an idea that keeps us moving north, it matters less than the fact that it focuses action. Focus breeds coordination. Coordination saves lives. The tension is an engine now. It can tear us apart, or it can push us to do the work we forgot to do when everything was easy. I keep calling names into the radio because people answer. Sometimes they come with help. Sometimes they arrive with knives. Sometimes they come with nothing but a story that keeps us awake. But the rising motion, that sense that something big is coming, is not a revelation so much as a fact we live with. We prepare. We argue. We trade. We hope. We are, in all these small human ways, still making a story worth telling. The sky changed the afternoon the decision had to be made. It was the sort of shift that hits first in the throat, a metallic tang, then a sound like distant tin being rolled across a roof. The ash grew heavier and the light went the color of old paper. The weather report in my head, the one I'd learned to read without maps, said, "This is the sort of sky that carries something worse than smoke." It already had a name in our ledger, chemical front. We'd seen them in the reports, the slow-moving storms that picked up ash and the byproduct of burned fields, that held acid and soot, and that could turn a person inside out if you were caught under it without shelter. And Bluewell, the rumor that had become a procession of hope, was finally not just a rumor. Leela came into the shack with dust in her hair and a look I've learned to parse. Measurement, exhaustion, and a hope so fragile you could have crushed it by breathing too hard. She carried the blue arrow sign on a splintered post, half buried and painted by an old hand. A hand that had once hoped someone would read it and come. The letters underneath, half eaten by grit, said BW. I followed the old ditch road, she said. There's a plant. Not big, but it still runs. Solar banks on the ridge. Old membranes. Someone's been keeping it up. She looked at me like she was asking for a verdict, not a question. I listened to the tremor in her voice and felt my chest hollow. Words spread as words do on a frequency. Fast and unreliable until confirmed. Joan called within the hour and said she could bring a guard and a pickup if we planned. Omar's voice came in later, quiet and practical. I can spare seeds and a tarp. I'll bring parts for the pump. The ledger filled with names and promises like a hymn book. People began to move, not yet in caravans but in determined steps, in neighbors and traders, and the poor souls who had nowhere else to go. Bluewell was the pole of the compass now. Then the report came through from a woman who traded in routes. A black flag caravan had been sighted, further north than before, moving with unusual speed and different tactics. They were clever, she said. They had mapped the old rails and learned to cut convoys at choke points. They had learned to use diversion and noise, to split convoys and pick off the stragglers. She used the word collectors for them, like people collecting debts. The words settled over our chatter like rain. I mapped the options in my head the way I used to map circuits. Option 1. Broadcast Bluewell coordinates openly. Hundreds might move toward it fast. The community could form with numbers and defense, and the DeSalle unit might feed enough people to keep everyone alive. But open broadcasting would be a beacon, and beacons draw predators. Option 2. Move people quietly, in staggered groups, trusting that smallness and discretion will outwit a caravan that needs a target worth hauling. That would preserve secrecy but slow movement. The chemical front could arrive while the convoy was still 3 days out. Option 3. Stage a decoy, make the shack look like a cache, and broadcast a false lead to draw the raiders away, while a thread of trusted people slipped north with the real coordinates hidden in our ledger. That was the riskiest. It meant I would be intentionally on the path of those men and their guns. I could feel my hands begin to tremble. For a long time I'd flattered myself that my decisions were measured, technical. A solder here, a filter fixed there. But this was not a solder joint I could resolder. This was a choice that would be measured in lives. I thought of the photograph under the jar of screws. I thought of the way Leela's laugh used to curl when she got to the part of a joke where she couldn't stop. I thought of Joan smoothing a piece of cloth over a child's eyes because the child was afraid of the sound of rain. The ledger did something to a person. It keeps names. It accrues obligations. I opened it and ran my thumb over the spidery pencil marks. Omar, Joan, Leela, the engineer's anonymous diagrams, the trader with the cracked smile who brought a membrane and asked for too much in return. The ledger was a spine and I felt it under my palm. There are rules here, strange rules, yes, and some are self-imposed. Do not broadcast coordinates in the clear if you can help it. Use the 3-tone danger code sparingly. Verify a report twice. But there are also the older rules you learn from history and muscle memory. Decoys work. Predators go where the light is strongest. Sacrifice is sometimes the currency of survival. I thought of the nights I had refused to trade the ledger, of the times I guarded secrets because secrets keep people safe. I also remembered the convoy that was ambushed last month because someone talked too freely about a well. I felt the calculation tighten, every memory a variable. I chose the decoy. Not because I was brave, though there was a stubborn thread of that, but because I had a confidence in one thing: sound. I knew the weight a voice carries. I knew how to make a broadcast that would sound like a prize too tempting to leave. I could lure them with the chorus of a working pump, with the promise of stacked drums and a soft, defenseless community. I would be the one to sing the siren. I would be the one to stay. We moved fast. Jones' group and Omar set up in the hollow of the East Ravine, concealed in scrub. Leela took a small team and the map and the blue sign and walked north with a headlamp and a courage that made me younger and more foolish each time I witnessed it. I spent the daylight wiring up a decoy, old drum barrels painted fresh, a false cache of casks and tins arranged as if hurriedly abandoned, signs of life left like breadcrumbs, a child's shoe, a half-burnt log, a kettle on an old scald. I set a shallow diversion, a scent trail of oil and used filters so any tracker would find a trail that led away from the real route. Inside the shack I prepared my voice. Radio work is showmanship as much as utility. I cleaned the mic, oiled the pedal, checked the antenna line twice. I set the transmitter for a long-range call, one that would sing across frequencies and make the shack sound like a small fortress with a big supply. I rigged a short loop of breakers to trigger a recorded sound of a working pump on the low band, a texture of life the raiders could not ignore. I prepared the encoded packets for Joan and Omar and the engineers, a low-power alternation on 6.2 with the real coordinates and a time lag for the movement. We had rehearsed the plan in 2 whispered sessions. Joan's voice was steady, Omar's hands were steady. Leela's last message before she left was a string of practicalities, unromantic and insistently human. I will not move at night along the old rail. I'll use the ditch road. If you cannot confirm within 48 hours, Route B, we had 48 hours, but the sky said fewer. The decoy had an extra element, a noisemaker, a crude device that would start a clanking pattern at dusk. Jerry cans rubbing against a wire under a trickle of wind, a recorded shout, the pump sound I'd set up as an attractant. It was theatrical, but the raiders were practical. They'd follow any sound that promised spoils. I set it to start after sunset and timed the long-range broadcast to begin shortly before. My hands were steady when I pedaled the generator for the last fuel run. I cranked until my calves ached, and then I clambered onto the transmitter seat and spoke not as Miles the remembering man, but as Miles the lure. The broadcast opened soft and ordinary. Weather notes, a check-in protocol, information about a pump that was nearly full and a clinic that had extra stock for those in need. I sprinkled details that made the prize believable, an address that was actually the name of the road, the scent of fresh coffee I had brewed the morning before and moved outside for effect, the sound of a child crying, a recording I'd pulled from an old file and edited until it fit. Then I let my voice go loud. I described, indirectly, a store with drums and a working membrane and a boat of canned peaches. I used the cadence of someone not trying to hide anything. I broadcast in the clear, because only loud broadcasts draw the greedy. The signal slid over the valleys and into the dark, and I watched the little meter creep up as distant receivers locked on. At the same time, in whispers under the hum, I flicked the low-power alternation to see if the engineers had received the real coordinates. A faint click, and Omar's voice answered, tight but present. Joan confirmed. Leela acknowledged on the encoded channel. We move at first light. The ledger filled with hope. The trap was set. The chemical front arrived faster than anyone expected. It came in on a gust like a shudder and in the smell of metal that wipes the throat. We had an hour of clear, clean light left if we were lucky. The decoy's clanging started right on schedule, punctuated by my dramatized broadcast and the recorded pump. I could see the dark shapes on the ridges, headlights like the eyes of something waking. The shack felt too small and too loud, and I felt as if every little thing I'd ever done was being measured against what was about to happen. They came with the hunger of people who had made complex choices and then let brutality answer them. The black flags rolled into the valley like a question. I watched them through the window, and for a moment history collapsed. They had the same impatience I've seen in men who learned to take as a solution. Guns glinted. Their leader walked forward, mask on, and shouted in a voice that did not belong to the land. They were better organized than the first raiders we'd seen. They moved in formation, flanked by people who kept watch for snipers, people who performed war like a trade. The first exchange was not by gunfire but words. They shouted across the field, and my voice, amplified and steady, called back in a voice meant to sound like an easy target. "We have drums. We have membranes. Come and get what you need," I said, and every word tasted like something else, like betrayal and salvage and a promise. They moved toward the decoy. They ransacked the drums and set one on a makeshift stand, and pretended to test the membrane with a flourish that implied more wealth than there was. Guns pointed at the emptiness, and men laughed with a cruelties that always seems to come easy to those who have taken to living by force. And in the dark, 3 hours after sunset, I pedaled until my legs burned and kept the transmitter alive. I listened to their voices as they celebrated. I recorded what they said, because information is always useful, and tomorrow there would be forensics and for choices yet to come. I spoke into the mic with a steady cadence, releasing every false treasure detail, because I knew this was the currency I had. The generator smoked, a thin blue line, and the pedal hummed under my feet like a living thing. Then the first drops came, not rain, but something the color of old pennies. It hissed as it hit the metal roof, and it made a sound like someone tearing cloth. We had built plastic sheeting into the interior. We pressed damp cloth into the vents. Acid began its slow business on the tarps, eating them like tiny teeth. I could feel the sting on my skin through the open window. I could hear the raiders still clearing out the decoy, their boots scuffing, their voices high with triumph. I knew then what the decision would cost me. If I stayed to be the lure, I was placing myself between those men and the people moving north. If I left to slip away and save my skin, I would be a different kind of coward, the kind who keeps his ledger clean at the cost of others. I put my hand on the jar of screws and felt the photograph's hard edge. My thumb brushed the curl of the paper, and, for a sliver of a second, I was not a radio operator but a man rendered small by the sheer scope of choices. The worst part was not the fear, it was the clarity. I chose, I stayed. I opened the mic, and with the acid rain beginning to eat at the world, I began a different kind of broadcast. It was not the lure this time, but a list. Coordinates, directions, times short, coded. A thread for Leela and Joan and Omar to follow if they encountered trouble. I told them not to stop at the old railway line. I told them to move the convoy into the ravine and to meet the engineers at the stone bridge. My voice cracked, but I kept it steady. I couldn't tell how many raiders still listened, perhaps none. But I kept calling because a voice can guide, even when your heart is pounding so loud it might drown the transmitter. As the raiders argued over stolen tins, gunshots rang out far off, and then a shadow moved across the ridge, Joan's pickup, flanked by slow, cautious bodies, moving like ghosts with tools and rifles and an intention that was not theft. They'd taken the long route, the one I'd taught them to use when the roads are watching. There was a moment when a man in black saw Joan's green tarp glint, and for a heartbeat I thought the plan had failed. Then Joan signaled, and the caravan split, and Leela's voice, thin and fierce, told me they had hit the dig road and were heading for the blue sign. The shack took the first real hit when a raider spotted motion at the window. He fired a warning shot that shattered glass and sent a cascade of tiny diamonds onto the floor. I felt the sting of a sliver on my forearm and tasted iron. The rain hissed louder, and the smell grew of copper and iron and burned rubber. I had minutes to keep the signal alive, to make sure the convoy cleared the ridge, to keep the raiders chasing a ghost. So I pedaled. I held the mic with one hand and a wrench in the other. I gave orders in short bursts and then sang that terrible little song of my voice. The broadcast that calls people to a promise. Leela's voice cut in near dawn, breathless. We see the pond, Miles. We see the panels. The sentence broke, and then she was gone with a flurry of static and prayer. I kept the mic open long enough to hear Omar swear softly in relief. Joan said nothing, because Joan says nothing when she is proud. We had done it. We had bought time, and we had baited danger away from them. I had stood between the raiders and the people who might become a living community. The shack smelled of copper and wet earth and the small smoke of a generator struggling. I was bleeding onto the floor from a cut on my wrist, but the ledger was on my lap and Leela's blue sign, half bent, scorched, leaned against the wall. The decision had not ended fighting. Gunfire still cracked in the distance. Men still moved under the black flags. The chemical front had not yet passed. But at that moment, when dawn threaded the sky the color of old paper, and the ledger held the names of people who had made it another hour, I felt a single, small certainty. Choices had consequences, and some consequences were worth making. I had gambled with a voice and a lie, and with the very small candle of my life to give other people a chance to move towards something that might be true. For once, the ledger had enough credits to justify the debt. I let the radio go quiet for a long time after the last check-in. My legs trembled and my chest felt raw. I closed my eyes and let myself hear, for the first time in a long while, the sound of other people moving. Wheels on dirt, voices low in the ravine, footsteps that were not the sound of retreat. The storm covered us with a hiss, and we waited for what came next. The morning after felt like waking under a different sun, not because the world had changed, but because I had. The chemical front had moved on eventually, as storms do, part weather, part consequence of everything we had done wrong. The ash lay in thicker drifts in the hollows, and the taste of metal stayed in my mouth for a day. My arm ached where the glass had cut me. The cut scabbed quickly in the heat, a small, stubborn line that felt like an accounting. The transmitter still worked. The ledger still had names. Leela's blue sign leaned against the wall like a flag someone had left to say we'd been here. The immediate outcome of the night before was a mixture of bright and ragged. Bluewell, the thing we dared to make real, was real. Leela's team had reached the plant, found the solar banks and the membranes, and a handful of people who had been keeping the place alive by sheer stubbornness. They welcomed the exhausted stragglers with a guarded hospitality, food measured out carefully, water rationed and given with a look that tested whether you would take more than your need. The DeSalle unit was small and imperfect, but functional. They had learned to run it off solar with a small battery bank, and to patch membranes with strips of surgical gauze when nothing better existed. It was not the miracle some had whispered of. It was infrastructure, time, and human labor made to work. It was enough to be useful. The people who made it through, the caravan that had split, the engineers who'd navigated the stone bridge, Jones' group, arrived with exhaustion written in the set of their faces and triumph quiet and practical. They brought with them stories of small heroics. Omar fixing a burnt contact by hand, Joan convincing a frightened grandmother to trust the ditch road, Leela calming a child who had nodded off on a tarp and then woke to see the solar panels. They left behind a handful of gifts. A pump stripped down to a core that could be reassembled. A coil of wiring someone had soldered by dim lantern light. A list of parts scrawled in shaky handwriting that the engineers swore they could find in a month. But victory was not victory in any grand sense. It was victory in small, sharp pieces. The raiders had been baited away from Bluewell, but they had not been destroyed. They had emptied our decoy and burned what plastic drums they could not carry, leaving the shells to rot in the sun. They would regroup. Men who live by taking do not forget a prize. We had bought time, not peace. Already there were reports of skirmishes along the old rail, and a trader who had traveled north with a pickup came home with stories of more black flags, more sudden collections. The chemical rain had done damage to the immediate area. Tarps and cloths dissolved in slow, spidered patterns. Some seeds I'd saved, the stubborn tomato strain, developed a white powder along the leaves where rain had touched them, and I had to toss those plants into the compost. Omar lost a row of young lettuce to the heat spike that followed the storm. We learned that acid does not announce itself, and that patience in drought can be undone by a single me-scheduled storm. In practical terms, it meant sorting what we could salvage for drinkable water and what we had to bury and isolate. Bluewell's desal plant could not reasonably support everyone in the valley. Not yet. It would be a hub and a lesson, a place that could train others in repair and maintenance, and could receive trade caravans under a guard schedule. It had to be defended, rationed, and most importantly, made replicable. That was what a community did, pass the knowledge forward. The fallout produced more moral ledger entries than the physical ones. A man named Raffi, who had once boasted he could buy a membrane cheaper than I could find a gasket, was shot by raiders while trying to scavenge for goods. He'd been someone I had judged too harshly for his bravado. His death hung in my throat like something I could have bottled. We buried him with no prayers worth the digging. The memory of that burial was a sharp little tooth that would gnaw at me for weeks. I found myself thinking about the trader with the cracked smile who wanted the ledger for a membrane. We'd refused him. Would things have changed if we had made a different trade? There is no currency that buys back a life. Internally, I had changed in ways I could not measure in height or scar tissue. The choice to stand in the path of the raiders, to be the lure, had not made me braver in any clean sense. It had made me more aware of the cost of being the voice. The ledger felt heavier in my lap. Names had context and weight now. Some were written in pencil with a shaky hand and others in biting ink. I slept less because a ledger weighs on a person, the way a child's hand does when you fall asleep with it in yours. Small and precious and impossible to ignore. At the same time, there was a new habit of humility. I had learned that sometimes the moral thing and the practical thing are the same. By keeping the shack noisy that night, I had put myself in danger, yes, but I had also protected the convoy. I had learned that being useful meant accepting risk, and that people could be incredible in the moments they chose courage. Joan's silent convoy technique, Omar's ability to coax life back into a burned contact, Leela's steadiness, these were not tales of myth. They were instruction manuals, and they saved more than a single life. My sense of responsibility had widened. I felt accountable not only to anyone who might tune in, but to those who listened and went. The community at Bluewell, small and pragmatic, began to look like what we had been starving for, a place that organized itself around production, not predation. They taught filtration techniques, membrane patching, solar maintenance. They set up guard rotations and basic triage. They accepted a newcomer only after a vetting period and a period of work. They were careful about visitors. We sent people back and forth. Joan foraging parties to help clear a buried pipe. Omar teaching soil amendment techniques in a collapsed parking lot greenhouse. Engineers working on a way to jury-rig a pump from 3 scavenged motors. The power of shared skill became the basis of the new trust, and that trust felt worth more than a day's worth of canned peaches. Nature did not heal so much as rearrange. In the weeks after the storm, small things happened that were not miracles but were remarkable. A sprout in a cracked drainage channel that someone had seeded with kitchen compost. A patch of moss under a shaded slab that refused the sun's authority. Bluewell's desal outflow, carefully rooted and filtered, fed a brackish pond that attracted birds, stubborn, hardy things that remembered the taste of water. Those birds were like a currency of hope. Seeing them meant that some systems could be coaxed back. But the scale of recovery was microscopic against the scale of collapse. The ash remained in the hollows. The horizon still looked like the underside of an old cigarette. We were not in a story of renewal. We were in a story of persistence. There were practical lessons that hardened into policy. We learned to move supplies in smaller loads so that a raid could not take everything. We developed a schedule where no single person held the keys to a system and insisted on redundancy. We started a small trade school, afternoons where anyone who wanted could learn to splice wire, patch a membrane, or build a solar still. Knowledge became a portable good, and we invested in people as we once invested in batteries. It was the most optimistic thing I have ever seen a people do. Teach and then step back and let others hold the skills. My sense of what I owed had shifted outward. I no longer thought just of keeping the shack alive. I thought of networks. I sent coded check-ins every day to the engineers to ask what parts they needed. Joan and I arranged a rotation to bring materials in small amounts so raids could be less tempting. Omar and Leela wrote a short pamphlet, hand-drawn diagrams, on building a low-cost filter from a collapsed refrigerator and a sheet of metal. I put it on the air in a short, stripped broadcast and watched the replies come in. 100 voices saying thanks, a dozen asking where they could find a ceramic filter. The ledger started to track not only names but needs and capacities, but grief did not lessen its hold. At night I dreamt of Rafi's last look, a contained, feral panic that matched the one I had felt when the raiders were close. I thought of the child in the convoy who had clutched her doll and whispered about a mother who was not with them. I thought of the photograph under the jar of screws and how small it made me feel, like a man who still clings to a single useful thing in a field of ruins. The ledger would grow and names would be added and crossed out, and I would continue to watch it like an altar. In the end, the falling action of the night before consolidated into a new pattern. Small, fragile communities anchored to functional technology and human commitments. We had a DeSalle unit that worked, a blue sign that meant something, and a map that had been altered. The old rail was a hazard now. The ditch road was a lifeline if you used it right. The raiders had not been stopped, only deferred. The chemical rains would come again, their chemistry would change. That is the truth. The world would not snap back to before, but we had bought ourselves a few seasons to learn, to teach, and to harden the little things that make life possible. I sit in the shack and look at the ledger and think of the arc of choices. We paid a price for saving others. We accepted that price because the alternative was to guard ourselves until we were islands. The choice changed me. I am more crooked with mercy and more candid about the cost of it. I am less comfortable with platitudes. Hope, I learned, is not a destination but an ethic. It is the daily work of tending to things that can be tended. It is teaching someone else to mend a pump. It is a pilot light in a world that wants to go out. We will rebuild what we can, not because the planet will heal in our lifetime, but because we owe ourselves the dignity of trying. The ledger will continue to fill, and names will become coordinates and skills, and little by little, that mess of information will become a lattice we can walk across. The aftermath is not a clean victory. It is a continuation with different rules, more caution, more sharing, more teaching, and a sharper sense of the costs. We have a place now that people can point to when they need proof that cooperation can outlast cruelty. That is not salvation. It is enough for now. Tonight the radio stays on a little longer. The generator breathes under my feet like a tired animal. Outside, someone is hammering on a sheet of metal, a sound that means building is happening. Somewhere in the valley, a child laughs, the kind of laugh that will one day be added to the ledger as a name to protect. I trace the letters of those names with my thumb and remember why I stayed in the path of danger. Because a voice can be a shield. And sometimes the smallest of shields is the only thing standing between a story that ends and one that continues. The world does not give you a tidy ending. It gives you weather and rubble and mornings that feel like examinations. If there is any mercy in the ledger, it is in the way small things gather, a working membrane, a child who laughs, a neighbor who comes back with a coil of wire. Bluewell is not a miracle. It is a breathing project. A plant, a few people, a schedule, a rota for guards. It scrapes by the way we all must now with improvisation, with jury-rigged parts, with favors repaid in labor and stories. That is the measure of hope here. Whatever you can make hold for a little longer than you thought possible. The cost of that hope is clear in my hands. The scar on my wrist itches with humidity and memory. The glass still sits like a small accusation under the nail. The ledger sits on the table with dust on its cover and names that have become weights and occasionally lifelines. People come and go. Some stay. Some leave with goods and a look that says they will not return. Some do not come back at all. We ration water, replace belts, swap seeds, teach someone how to splice a wire. None of these things are glamorous. They are mundane acts of survival dressed up as devotion. I keep the radio on because it is the smallest, most stubborn way to say we exist. A broadcast is a declaration, a signal that somebody is awake and listening, and that your voice can find theirs across a valley. I have learned that the act of speaking is itself a kind of medicine. People tune in for practical reasons, to hear where the convoy will be, to know if the road is clear, to get a patch for a broken pump. But they also tune in because we are hungry for other human voices. We are hungry to be counted. The moral calculations do not end. Each day carries a new ledger entry. Who needed water? Who coaxed the pump back to life? Who traded a jar of apricots for a bolt? I do not have illusions about my own heroism. The night I chose to be the decoy was not noble in a holy way. It was a pragmatic gamble wrapped around a duty I had accepted by default. The consequences were both immediate and slow. We bought time for Bluewell, and we invited a new cycle of violence to the edge of our map. That is the calculus now. One life bought the chance for many, and the cost will continue to echo. Still, and this is important, the echoes are not all pain. There is laughter in the greenhouse when a stubborn sprout unfurls. There is a particular joy when someone who has never held a soldering iron learns to make a connection that holds. There are mornings when a bird alights on the desal outflow, and its bright surprise feels like punctuation, a small proof that some things can be coaxed back into pattern. Those moments are thin, but enough. They are the stitches we use to hold a fraying garment together. Preparing for the future is not the same as pretending the past can be restored. We do not fantasize about returning to what was. That is a cruelty of memory. Instead, we build systems that survive the kinds of weather we now expect. Redundancy in water storage, knowledge circulation so one person is never the sole keeper of a skill, small-scale power that can be repaired with hands and scavenged parts. We teach more than we hoard. That has become a form of resistance against those who would hoard by force. I have a simple list now that I call my small polity. Keep the transmitter running, teach 3 people to mend a pump, rotate the guard schedule at Bluewell, and check the filters every morning. It is a list that fits on a scrap of paper because grand plans die fast here. The small plans endure because they are actionable and because they invite others to join. The ledger is not only a list of names. It is the map of who can do what and who needs what. We use it to build resilience in tiny increments. My final obligation, the one that tastes of salt and rust and stubborn care, is to tell the truth with care. A voice can save and it can doom. I do not broadcast coordinates in the clear unless we can balance the risk. I do not romanticize bravery. I speak plainly about how to make a filter, how to boil, how to keep sparks from a soldering iron from turning into a wildfire. I tell the small stories of people who did something ordinary and useful. Those stories are seeds. So what is my message in the end when the chemical skies have passed and the ledger is closed for the night? It is neither prophecy nor sermon. It is simple and practical and stubborn. Tend what you can tend, teach what you know, and keep the line open. Stay noisy enough that predators have to work for their prizes. Quiet enough that secrets of survival cannot be looted in a single raid. Share your skills. Keep a spare spark plug somewhere no raider thinks to look. Water your seedlings at dusk. Teach a neighbor to splice a solar lead. Laugh when a child drops a tin and is more upset about the dent than the loss. Hope is fragile here because it has to be made every day. But fragile does not mean futile. It means careful. It means a deliberate refusal to let silence win. It means that we will keep teaching each other things that outlast a single person. How to mend a membrane, how to coax a plant, how to ride out a chemical front. It means ledger entries that read like vows. Tonight the generator hums under my feet and there is a lamp of low, honest light in the shack. Outside, I hear someone hammering and another person laughing softly. Leela is somewhere with dirt under her nails and a look on her face that could harden into a leader. Joan's convoy is doing rounds. Omar has planted a new bed of beans and is counting his blessings in beans and notations. Bluewell sends a short check-in over the low band. All is holding for now. I do not know if we will survive the next storm. I do not know if the raiders will learn to be kinder or more vicious. I do not know how many names the ledger will lose or gain. What I know is this: as long as someone is willing to sit at a microphone and call names into the silence, and as long as someone else picks up and answers, there is an architecture of life we can build. It will be small. It will be flawed. It will be ours. So for tonight and tomorrow, and for as many dawns as we can buy, keep the radio on. Teach what you know. Carry a spare filter in your pack. Tell the child a joke and teach them how to boil water. Keep the ledger open and add a name when you can. Stay alive. Stay human.